Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Preamble. This agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. It also seeks to strengthen universal peace and larger freedom. We recognize that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. All countries and all stakeholders, acting in collaborative partnership, will implement this plan. We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and want and to heal and secure our planet. We are determined to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. As we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets which we are announcing today demonstrate the scale and ambition of this new universal agenda. They seek to build on the Millennium Development Goals and complete what they did not achieve. They seek to realize the human rights of all and to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. They are integrated and indivisible and balance the three dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, social, and environmental. The goals and targets will stimulate action over the next 15 years in areas of critical importance for humanity and the planet. People. We are determined to end poverty and hunger, in all their forms and dimensions, and to ensure that all human beings can fulfill their potential in dignity and equality and in a healthy environment. Planet. We are determined to protect the planet from degradation, including through sustainable consumption and production, sustainably managing its natural resources and taking urgent action on climate change, so that it can support the needs of the present and future generations. Prosperity. We are determined to ensure that all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives and that economic, social, and technological progress occurs in harmony with nature. Peace. We are determined to foster peaceful, just and inclusive societies which are free from fear and violence. There can be no sustainable development without peace and no peace without sustainable development. Partnership. We are determined to mobilize the means required to implement this agenda through a revitalized global partnership for sustainable development, based on a spirit of strengthened global solidarity, focused in particular on the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable and with the participation of all countries, all stakeholders, and all people. The interlinkage and integrated nature of the Sustainable Development Goals are of crucial importance in ensuring that the purpose of the new agenda is realized. If we realize our ambitions across the full extent of the agenda, the lives of all will be profoundly improved, and our world will be transformed for the better. Declaration. Introduction. 1. We, the heads of state and government and high representatives, meeting at United Nations headquarters in New York from 25 to September 27, 2015 as the organization celebrates its 70th anniversary, have decided today on new global sustainable development goals. 2. On behalf of the peoples we serve, we have adopted a historic decision on a comprehensive, far-reaching and people-centered set of universal and transformative goals and targets. We commit ourselves to working tirelessly for the full implementation of this agenda by 2030. We recognize that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. We are committed to achieving sustainable development in its three dimensions: economic, social, and environmental in a balanced and integrated manner. We will also build upon the achievements of the Millennium Development Goals and seek to address their unfinished business. 3. We resolve, between now and 2030, to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful, just and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. We resolve also to create conditions for sustainable, inclusive, and sustained economic growth, shared prosperity and decent work for all, taking into account different levels of national development and capacities. 4. As we embark on this great collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind. Recognizing that the dignity of the human person is fundamental, we wish to see the goals and targets met for all nations and peoples and for all segments of society. And we will endeavor to reach the furthest behind first. 5. This is an agenda of unprecedented scope and significance. It is accepted by all countries and is applicable to all, taking into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development and respecting national policies and priorities. These are universal goals and targets which involve the entire world, developed and developing countries alike. They are integrated and indivisible and balance the three dimensions of sustainable development. 6. The goals and targets are the result of over 2 years of intensive public consultation and engagement with civil society and other stakeholders around the world, which paid particular attention to the voices of the poorest and most vulnerable. This consultation included valuable work done by the Open Working Group of the General Assembly on Sustainable Development Goals and by the United Nations, whose Secretary General provided a synthesis report in December 2014. Our vision. 7. In these goals and targets, we are setting out a supremely ambitious and transformational vision. We envisage a world free of poverty, hunger, disease, and want, where all life can thrive. We envisage a world free of fear and violence. A world with universal literacy. A world with equitable and universal access to quality education at all levels, to health care and social protection, where physical, mental and social well-being are assured. A world where we reaffirm our commitments regarding the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, and where there is improved hygiene, and where food is sufficient, safe, affordable, and nutritious. A world where human habitats are safe, resilient, and sustainable, and where there is universal access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. 8. We envisage a world of universal respect for human rights and human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality, and non-discrimination, of respect for race, ethnicity and cultural diversity, and of equal opportunity, permitting the full realization of human potential and contributing to shared prosperity. A world which invests in its children and in which every child grows up free from violence and exploitation. A world in which every woman and girl enjoys full gender equality and all legal, social, and economic barriers to their empowerment have been removed. A just, equitable, tolerant, open and socially inclusive world in which the needs of the most vulnerable are met. 9. We envisage a world in which every country enjoys sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth and decent work for all. A world in which consumption and production patterns and use of all natural resources from air to land, from rivers, lakes and aquifers to oceans and seas are sustainable. One in which democracy, good governance, and the rule of law, as well as an enabling environment at the national and international levels, are essential for sustainable development, including sustained and inclusive economic growth, social development, environmental protection, and the eradication of poverty and hunger. One in which development and the application of technology are climate sensitive, respect biodiversity and are resilient. One in which humanity lives in harmony with nature and in which wildlife and other living species are protected. Our shared principles and commitments. 10. The new agenda is guided by the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, including full respect for international law. It is grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international human rights treaties, the Millennium Declaration and the 2005 World Summit Outcome. It is informed by other instruments such as the Declaration on the Right to Development. 11. We reaffirm the outcomes of all major United Nations conferences and summits which have laid a solid foundation for sustainable development and have helped to shape the new agenda. These include the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the World Summit for Social Development, the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development, the Beijing Platform for Action and the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development. We also reaffirm the follow-up to these conferences, including the outcomes of the 4th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries, the 3rd International Conference on Small Island Developing States, the 2nd United Nations Conference on landlocked developing countries and the Third United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. 12. We reaffirm all the principles of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, including, inter alia, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, as set out in Principle 7 thereof. 13. The challenges and commitments identified at these major conferences and summits are interrelated and call for integrated solutions. To address them effectively, a new approach is needed. Sustainable development recognizes that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, combating inequality within and among countries, preserving the planet, creating sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth and fostering social inclusion are linked to each other and are interdependent. Our world today. 14. We are meeting at a time of immense challenges to sustainable development. Billions of our citizens continue to live in poverty and are denied a life of dignity. There are rising inequalities within and among countries. There are enormous disparities of opportunity, wealth and power. Gender inequality remains a key challenge. Unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, is a major concern. Global health threats, more frequent and intense. Natural disasters, spiraling conflict, violent extremism, terrorism, and related humanitarian crises and forced displacement of people threaten to reverse much of the development progress made in recent decades. Natural resource depletion and adverse impacts of environmental degradation, including desertification, drought, land degradation, freshwater scarcity and loss of biodiversity, add to and exacerbate the list of challenges which humanity faces. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and its adverse impacts undermine the ability of all countries to achieve sustainable development. Increases in global temperature, sea level rise, ocean acidification and other climate change impacts are seriously affecting coastal areas and low-lying coastal countries, including many least developed countries and small island developing states. The survival of many societies, and of the biological support systems of the planet, is at risk. 15. It is also, however, a time of immense opportunity. Significant progress has been made in meeting many development challenges. Within the past generation, hundreds of millions of people have emerged from extreme poverty. Access to education has greatly increased for both boys and girls. The spread of information and communications technology and global interconnectedness has great potential to accelerate human progress, to bridge the digital divide and to develop knowledge societies, as does scientific and technological innovation across areas as diverse as medicine and energy. 16. Almost 15 years ago, the Millennium Development Goals were agreed. These provided an important framework for development, and significant progress has been made in a number of areas. But the progress has been uneven, particularly in Africa, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries and small island developing states, and some of the Millennium Development Goals remain off track, in particular those related to maternal, newborn and child health and to reproductive health. We recommit ourselves to the full realization of all the Millennium Development Goals, including the off-track Millennium Development Goals, in particular by providing focused and scaled-up assistance to least developed countries and other countries in special situations, in line with relevant support programs. The new agenda builds on the Millennium Development Goals and seeks to complete what they did not achieve, particularly in reaching the most vulnerable. 17. In its scope, however, the framework we are announcing today goes far beyond the Millennium Development Goals. Alongside continuing development priorities such as poverty eradication, health, education, and food security and nutrition, it sets out a wide range of economic, social, and environmental objectives. It also promises more peaceful and inclusive societies. It also, crucially, defines means of implementation. Reflecting the integrated approach that we have decided on, there are deep interconnections and many cross-cutting elements across the new goals and targets. The new agenda. 18. We are announcing today 17 Sustainable Development Goals with 169 associated targets which are integrated and indivisible. Never before have world leaders pledged common action and endeavor across such a broad and universal policy agenda. We are setting out together on the path towards sustainable development, devoting ourselves collectively to the pursuit of global development and of win-win cooperation which can bring huge gains to all countries in all parts of the world. We reaffirm that every state has and shall freely exercise full permanent sovereignty over all its wealth, natural resources and economic activity. We will implement the agenda for the full benefit of all, for today's generation and for future generations. In doing so, we reaffirm our commitment to international law and emphasize that the agenda is to be implemented in a manner that is consistent with the rights and obligations of states under international law. 19. We reaffirm the importance of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as other international instruments relating to human rights and international law. We emphasize the responsibilities of all states, in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations, to respect, protect and promote human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction of any kind as to race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, disability, or other status. 20. Realizing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls will make a crucial contribution to progress across all the goals and targets. The achievement of full human potential and of sustainable development is not possible if one half of humanity continues to be denied its full human rights and opportunities. Women and girls must enjoy equal access to quality education, economic resources, and political participation as well as equal opportunities with men and boys for employment, leadership, and decision-making at all levels. We will work for a significant increase in investments to close the gender gap and strengthen support for institutions in relation to gender equality and the empowerment of women at the global, regional, and national levels. All forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls will be eliminated, including through the engagement of men and boys. The systematic mainstreaming of a gender perspective in the implementation of the agenda is crucial. 21. The new goals and targets will come into effect on January 1, 2016 and will guide the decisions we take over the next 15 years. All of us will work to implement the agenda within our own countries and at the regional and global levels, taking into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development and respecting national policies and priorities. We will respect national policy space for sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, in particular for developing states, while remaining consistent with relevant international rules and commitments. We acknowledge also the importance of the regional and sub-regional dimensions, regional economic integration and interconnectivity in sustainable development. Regional and sub-regional frameworks can facilitate the effective translation of sustainable development policies into concrete action at the national level. 22. Each country faces specific challenges in its pursuit of sustainable development. The most vulnerable countries and, in particular, African countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries and small island developing states, deserve special attention, as do countries in situations of conflict and post-conflict countries. There are also serious challenges within many middle-income countries. 23. People who are vulnerable must be empowered. Those whose needs are reflected in the agenda include all children, youth, persons with disabilities, of whom more than 80% live in poverty, people living with HIV/AIDS, older persons, indigenous peoples, refugees, and internally displaced persons and migrants. We resolve to take further effective measures and actions, in conformity with international law, to remove obstacles and constraints, strengthen support and meet the special needs of people living in areas affected by complex humanitarian emergencies and in areas affected by terrorism. 24. We are committed to ending poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including by eradicating extreme poverty by 2030. All people must enjoy a basic standard of living, including through social protection systems. We are also determined to end hunger and to achieve food security as a matter of priority and to end all forms of malnutrition. In this regard, we reaffirm the important role and inclusive nature of the Committee on World Food Security. and welcome the Rome Declaration on Nutrition and the framework for action. We will devote resources to developing rural areas and sustainable agriculture and fisheries, supporting smallholder farmers, especially women farmers, herders, and fishers in developing countries, particularly least developed countries. 25. Commit to providing inclusive and equitable quality education at all levels: early childhood, primary, secondary, tertiary, technical and vocational training. All people, irrespective of sex, age, race, or ethnicity, and persons with disabilities, migrants, indigenous peoples, children, and youth, especially those in vulnerable situations, should have access to lifelong learning opportunities that help them to acquire the knowledge and skills needed to exploit opportunities and to participate fully in society. We will strive to provide children and youth with a nurturing environment for the full realization of their rights and capabilities, helping our countries to reap the demographic dividend, including through safe schools and cohesive communities and families. 26. To promote physical and mental health and well-being, and to extend life expectancy for all, we must achieve universal health coverage and access to quality health care. No one must be left behind. We commit to accelerating the progress made to date in reducing newborn, child and maternal mortality by ending all such preventable deaths before 2030. We are committed to ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including for family planning, information, and education. We will equally accelerate the pace of progress made in fighting malaria, HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, hepatitis, Ebola and other communicable diseases and epidemics, including by addressing growing antimicrobial resistance and the problem of unattended diseases affecting developing countries. We are committed to the prevention and treatment of non-communicable diseases, including behavioral, developmental, and neurological disorders, which constitute a major challenge for sustainable development. 27. We will seek to build strong economic foundations for all our countries. Sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth is essential for prosperity. This will only be possible if wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. We will work to build dynamic, sustainable, innovative, and people-centered economies, promoting youth employment and women's economic empowerment, in particular, and decent work for all. We will eradicate forced labor and human trafficking and end child labor in all its forms. All countries stand to benefit from having a healthy and well-educated workforce with the knowledge and skills needed for productive and fulfilling work in full participation in society. We will strengthen the productive capacities of least developed countries in all sectors, including through structural transformation. We will adopt policies which increase productive capacities, productivity and productive employment, financial inclusion, sustainable agriculture, pastoralist and fisheries development, sustainable industrial development, universal access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy services, sustainable transport systems, and quality and resilient infrastructure. 28. Commit to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services. Governments, international organizations, the business sector, and other non-state actors and individuals must contribute to changing unsustainable consumption and production patterns, including through the mobilization, from all sources, of financial and technical assistance to strengthen developing countries' scientific, technological and innovative capacities to move towards more sustainable patterns of consumption and production. We encourage the implementation of the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns. All countries take action, with developed countries taking the lead, taking into account the development and capabilities of developing countries. 29. We recognize the positive contribution of migrants for inclusive growth and sustainable development. We also recognize that international migration is a multidimensional reality of major relevance for the development of countries of origin, transit, and destination, which requires coherent and comprehensive responses. We will cooperate internationally to ensure safe, orderly, and regular migration involving full respect for human rights and the humane Treatment of migrants regardless of migration status, of refugees, and of displaced persons. Such cooperation should also strengthen the resilience of communities hosting refugees, particularly in developing countries. We underline the right of migrants to return to their country of citizenship, and recall that states must ensure that their returning nationals are duly received. 30 states are strongly urged to refrain from promulgating and applying any unilateral economic, financial or trade measures not in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations that impede the full achievement of economic and social development, particularly in developing countries. 31. We acknowledge that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the primary international, intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. We are determined to address decisively the threat posed by climate change and environmental degradation. The global nature of climate change calls for the widest possible international cooperation aimed at accelerating the reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions and addressing adaptation to the adverse impacts of climate change. We note with grave concern the significant gap between the aggregate effect of parties' mitigation pledges in terms of global annual emissions of greenhouse gases by 2020 and aggregate emission pathways consistent with having a likely chance of holding the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. 32. Looking ahead to the 21st session of the Conference of the Parties in Paris, we underscore the commitment of all states to work for an ambitious and universal climate agreement. We reaffirm that the protocol, another legal instrument or agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties, shall address in a balanced manner inter alia, mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology development and transfer and capacity building, and transparency of action and support. 33. We recognize that social and economic development depends on the sustainable management of our planet's natural resources. We are therefore determined to conserve and sustainably use oceans and seas, freshwater resources, as well as forests, mountains and drylands, and to protect biodiversity, ecosystems, and wildlife. We are also determined to promote sustainable tourism, to tackle water scarcity and water pollution, to strengthen cooperation on desertification, dust storms, land degradation and drought, and to promote resilience and disaster risk reduction. In this regard, we look forward to the 13th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity to be held in Mexico. 34. We recognize that sustainable urban development and management are crucial to the quality of life of our people. We will work with local authorities and communities to renew and plan our cities and human settlements so as to foster community cohesion and personal security and to stimulate innovation and employment. We will reduce the negative impacts of urban activities and of chemicals which are hazardous for human health and the environment, including through the environmentally sound management and safe use of chemicals, the reduction and recycling of waste, and the more efficient use of water and energy. And we will work to minimize the impact of cities on the global climate system. We will also take account of population trends and projections in our national rural and urban development strategies and policies. We look forward to the upcoming United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development to be held in Quito. 35. Sustainable development cannot be realized without peace and security, and peace and security will be at risk without sustainable development. The new agenda recognizes the need to build peaceful, just and inclusive societies that provide equal access to justice and that are based on respect for human rights, including the right to development, on effective rule of law and good governance at all levels, and on transparent, effective, and accountable institutions. Factors which give rise to violence, insecurity, and injustice, such as inequality, corruption, poor governance, and illicit financial and arms flows, are addressed in the agenda. We must redouble our efforts to resolve or prevent conflict and to support post-conflict countries, including through ensuring that women have a role in peace building and state building. We call for further effective measures and actions to be taken, in conformity with international law, to remove the obstacles to the full realization of the right of self-determination of peoples living under colonial and foreign occupation, which continue to adversely affect their economic and social development as well as their environment. 36. We pledge to foster intercultural understanding, tolerance, mutual respect, and an ethic of global citizenship and shared responsibility. We acknowledge the natural and cultural diversity of the world and recognize that all cultures and civilizations can contribute to, and are crucial enablers of, sustainable development. 37. Sport is also an important enabler of sustainable development. We recognize the growing contribution of sport to the realization of development and peace in its promotion of tolerance and respect and the contributions it makes to the empowerment of women and of young people, individuals, and communities as well as to health, education and social inclusion. Objectives. 38. We reaffirm, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, the need to respect the territorial integrity and political independence of states. Means of implementation. 39. The scale and ambition of the new agenda requires a revitalized global partnership to ensure its implementation. We fully commit to this. This partnership will work in a spirit of global solidarity, in particular solidarity with the poorest and with people in vulnerable situations. It will facilitate an intensive global engagement in support of implementation of all the goals and targets, bringing together governments, the private sector, civil society, the United Nations system and other actors and mobilizing all available resources. 40. The means of implementation targets under Goal 17 and under each Sustainable Development Goal are key to realizing our agenda and are of equal importance with the other goals and targets. The agenda, including the Sustainable Development Goals, can be met within the framework of a revitalized global partnership for sustainable development, supported by the concrete policies and actions as outlined in the outcome document of the Third International Conference on Financing for Development, held in Addis Ababa from 13 to July 16, 2015. We welcome the endorsement by the General Assembly of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is an integral part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We recognize that the full implementation of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda is critical for the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals and targets. 41. We recognize that each country has primary responsibility for its own economic and social development. The new agenda deals with the means required for implementation of the goals and targets. We recognize that these will include the mobilization of financial resources as well as capacity building and the transfer of environmentally sound technologies to developing countries on favorable terms, including on concessional and preferential terms, as mutually agreed. Public finance, both domestic and international, will play a vital role in providing essential services and public goods and in catalyzing other sources of finance. We acknowledge the role of the diverse private sector, ranging from micro-enterprises to cooperatives to multinationals, and that of civil society organizations and philanthropic organizations in the implementation of the new agenda. 42. We support the implementation of relevant strategies and programs of action, including the Istanbul Declaration and Program of Action, the SIDS Accelerated Modalities of Action, Samoa Pathway and the Vienna Program of Action for Landlocked Developing Countries for the decade 2014 to 2024, and reaffirm the importance of supporting the African Union's Agenda 2063 and the program of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, all of which are integral to the new agenda. We recognize the major challenge to the achievement of durable peace and sustainable development in countries in conflict and post-conflict situations. 43. We emphasize that international public finance plays an important role in complementing the efforts of countries to mobilize public resources domestically, especially in the poorest and most vulnerable countries with limited domestic resources. An important use of international public finance, including official development assistance, ODA, is to catalyze additional resource mobilization from other sources, public and private. ODA providers reaffirm their respective commitments, including the commitment by many developed countries to achieve the target of 0.7% of gross national income for official development assistance, ODA/GNI, to developing countries and 0.15% to 0.2% of ODA/GNI to least developed countries. 44 We acknowledge the importance for international financial institutions to support, in line with their mandates, the policy space of each country, in particular developing countries. We recommit to broadening and strengthening the voice and participation of developing countries including African countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small island developing states and middle-income countries in international economic decision-making, norm-setting and global economic governance. 45 We acknowledge also the essential role of national parliaments through their enactment of legislation and adoption of budgets and their role in ensuring accountability for the effective implementation of our commitments. Governments and public institutions will also work closely on implementation with regional and local authorities, sub-regional institutions, international institutions, academia, philanthropic organizations, volunteer groups and others. 46 We underline the important role and comparative advantage of an adequately resourced, relevant, coherent, efficient and effective United Nations system in supporting the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainable development, while stressing the importance of strengthened national ownership and leadership at the country level. We express our support for the ongoing dialogue in the Economic and Social Council on the longer-term positioning of the United Nations development system in the context of this agenda. Follow-up and review. 47 Our governments have the primary responsibility for follow-up and review, at the national, regional, and global levels, in relation to the progress made in implementing the goals and targets over the coming 15 years. To support accountability to our citizens, we will provide for systematic follow-up and review at the various levels, as set out in this agenda and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. The high-level political forum under the auspices of the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council will have the central role in overseeing follow-up and review at the global level. 48 Indicators are being developed to assist this work. Quality, accessible, timely and reliable disaggregated data will be needed to help with the measurement of progress and to ensure that no one is left behind. Such data is key to decision-making. Data and information from existing reporting mechanisms should be used where possible. We agree to intensify our efforts to strengthen statistical capacities in developing countries, particularly African countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small island developing states and middle-income countries. We are committed to developing broader measures of progress to complement gross domestic product. A call for action to change our world. 49 70 years ago, an earlier generation of world leaders came together to create the United Nations. From the ashes of war and division they fashioned this organization and the values of peace, dialogue, and international cooperation which underpin it. The supreme embodiment of those values is the Charter of the United Nations. 50 Today we are also taking a decision of great historic significance. We resolve to build a better future for all people, including the millions who have been denied the chance to lead decent, dignified, and rewarding lives and to achieve their full human potential. We can be the first generation to succeed in ending poverty, just as we may be the last to have a chance of saving the planet. The world will be a better place in 2030 if we succeed in our objectives. 51 What we are announcing today, an agenda for global action for the next 15 years, is a charter for people and planet in the 21st century. Children and young women and men are critical agents of change and will find in the new goals a platform to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. 52 We the peoples are the celebrated opening words of the Charter of the United Nations. It is, we the peoples, who are embarking today on the road to 2030. Our journey will involve governments as well as parliaments, the United Nations system and other international institutions, local authorities, indigenous peoples, civil society, business, and the private sector, the scientific and academic community and all people. Millions have already engaged with, and will own, this agenda. It is an agenda of the people, by the people and for the people, and this, we believe, will ensure its success. 53 The future of humanity and of our planet lies in our hands. It lies also in the hands of today's younger generation who will pass the torch to future generations. We have mapped The road to sustainable development, it will be for all of us to ensure that the journey is successful and its gains irreversible. Sustainable Development Goals and Targets. 54. Following an inclusive process of intergovernmental negotiations, and based on the proposal of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, which includes a chapeau contextualizing the latter, set out below are the goals and targets which we have agreed. 55. The Sustainable Development Goals and targets are integrated and indivisible, global in nature and universally applicable, taking into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development and respecting national policies and priorities. Targets are defined as aspirational and global, with each government setting its own national targets guided by the global level of ambition but taking into account national circumstances. Each government will also decide how these aspirational and global targets should be incorporated into national. Contained in the report of the Open Working Group of the General Assembly on Sustainable Development Goals, A/68/970 and CORR1, see also A/68/970 add. 1 and 2. Planning processes, policies and strategies. It is important to recognize the link between sustainable development and other relevant ongoing processes in the economic, social and environmental fields. 56. In deciding upon these goals and targets, we recognize that each country faces specific challenges to achieve sustainable development, and we underscore the special challenges facing the most vulnerable countries and, in particular, African countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries and small island developing states, as well as the specific challenges facing the middle-income countries. Countries in situations of conflict also need special attention. 57. We recognize that baseline data for several of the targets remains unavailable, and we call for increased support for strengthening data collection and capacity building in member states, to develop national and global baselines where they do not yet exist. We commit to addressing this gap in data collection so as to better inform the measurement of progress, in particular for those targets below which do not have clear numerical targets. 58. We encourage ongoing efforts by states and other forums to address key issues which pose potential challenges to the implementation of our agenda, and we respect the independent mandates of those processes. We intend that the agenda and its implementation would support, and be without prejudice to, those other processes and the decisions taken therein. 59. We recognize that there are different approaches, visions, models and tools available to each country, in accordance with its national circumstances and priorities, to achieve sustainable development, and we reaffirm that planet Earth and its ecosystems are our common home and that Mother Earth is a common expression in a number of countries and regions. Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 1. End poverty in all its forms everywhere. Goal 2. End hunger, achieve food security and improved nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Goal 3. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Goal 4. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Goal 5. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Goal 6. Ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Goal 7. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Goal 8. Promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. Goal 9. Build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization and foster innovation. Goal 10. Reduce inequality within and among countries. Goal 11. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Goal 12. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Goal 13. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts *. Goal 14. Conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Goal 15. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably. Manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. Goal 16. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. Provide access to justice for all and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Goal 17. Strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. Acknowledging that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the primary international, intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. Goal 1. End poverty in all its forms everywhere. 1.1 By 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. 1.2 By 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. 1.3 Implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including floors, and by 2030 achieve substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable. 1.4 By 2030, ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to basic services, ownership, and control over land and other forms of property, inheritance, natural resources, appropriate new technology and financial services, including microfinance. 1.5 By 2030, build the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations and reduce their exposure and vulnerability to climate-related extreme events and other economic, social, and environmental shocks and disasters. Ensure significant mobilization of resources from a variety of sources, including through enhanced development cooperation, in order to provide adequate and predictable means for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, to implement programs and policies to end poverty in all its dimensions. 1.6 Create sound policy frameworks at the national, regional, and international levels, based on proper and gender-sensitive development strategies, to support accelerated investment in poverty eradication actions. Goal 2. End hunger, achieve food security and improved nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. 2.1 By 2030, end hunger and ensure access by all people, in particular the poor and people in vulnerable situations, including infants, to safe, nutritious and sufficient food all year round. 2.2 By 2030, end all forms of malnutrition, including achieving, by 2025, the internationally agreed targets on stunting and wasting in children under 5 years of age, and address the nutritional needs of adolescent girls, pregnant and lactating women and older persons. 2.3 By 2030, double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, in particular women, indigenous peoples, family farmers, pastoralists, and fishers, including through secure and equal access to land, other productive resources and inputs, knowledge, financial services, markets, and opportunities for value addition and non-farm employment. 2.4 By 2030, ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agricultural practices that increase productivity and production, that help maintain ecosystems, that strengthen capacity for adaptation to climate change, extreme weather, drought, flooding and other disasters, and that progressively improve land and soil quality. 2.5 By 2020, maintain the genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants, and farmed and domesticated animals and their related wild species, including through soundly managed and diversified seed and plant banks at the national, regional, and international levels, and promote access to and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, as internationally agreed. 2. Increase investment, including through enhanced international cooperation, in rural infrastructure, agricultural research and extension services, technology development and plant and livestock gene banks in order to enhance agricultural productive capacity in developing countries, in particular least developed countries. 2.6 Correct and prevent trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets, including through the parallel elimination of all forms of agricultural export subsidies and all export measures with equivalent effect, in accordance with the mandate of the Doha Development Round. 2.c Adopt measures to ensure the proper functioning of food commodity markets and their derivatives and facilitate timely access to market information, including on food reserves, in order to help limit extreme food price volatility. Goal 3. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. 3.1 By 2030, reduce the global maternal mortality ratio to less than 70 per 100,000 live births. 3.2 By 2030, end preventable deaths of newborns and children under 5 years of age, with all countries aiming to reduce neonatal mortality to at least as low as 12 per 1,000 live births, and under 5 mortality to at least as low as 25 per 1,000 live births. 3.3 By 2030, end the epidemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases and combat hepatitis, waterborne diseases, and other communicable diseases. 3.4 By 2030, reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases through prevention and treatment and promote mental health and well-being. 3.5 Strengthen the prevention and treatment of substance abuse, including narcotic drug abuse and harmful use of alcohol. 3.6 By 2020, have the number of global deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents. 3.7 By 2030, ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including for family planning, information, and education, and the integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs. 3.8 Achieve universal health coverage, including financial risk protection, access to quality, essential health care services and access to safe, effective, quality and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all. 3.9 By 2030, substantially reduce the number of deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals in air, water, and soil pollution and contamination. 3. Strengthen the implementation of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in all countries, as appropriate. 3.6 Support the research and development of vaccines and medicines for the communicable and non-communicable diseases that primarily affect developing countries, provide access to affordable essential medicines and vaccines, in accordance with the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health, which affirms the right of developing countries to use to the provisions in the Agreement on Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights regarding flexibilities to protect public health, and, in particular, provide access to medicines for all. 3.c Substantially increase health financing and the recruitment, development, training and retention of the health workforce in developing countries, especially in least developed countries and small island developing states. 3.d Strengthen the capacity of all countries, in particular developing countries, for early warning, risk reduction, and management of national and global health risks. Goal 4. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. 4.1 By 2030, ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable and quality primary and secondary education leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. 4.2 By 2030, ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education so that they are ready for primary education. 4.3 By 2030, ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational and tertiary education, including university. 4.4 By 2030, substantially increase the number of youth and adults who have relevant skills, including technical and vocational skills, for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship. 4.5 By 2030, eliminate gender disparities in education and ensure equal access to all levels of education and vocational training for the vulnerable, including persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples and children in vulnerable situations. 4.6 By 2030, ensure that all youth and a substantial proportion of adults, both men and women, achieve literacy and numeracy. 4.7 By 2030, ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. 4. Build and upgrade education facilities that are child, disability, and gender sensitive and provide safe, non-violent, inclusive, and effective learning environments for all. 4.6 By 2020, substantially expand globally the number of scholarships available to developing countries, in particular least developed countries, small island developing states, and African countries, for enrollment in higher education, including vocational training and information and communications technology, technical, engineering and scientific programs, in developed countries and other developing countries. 4.C By 2030, substantially increase the supply of qualified teachers, including through international cooperation for teacher training in developing countries, especially least developed countries and small island developing states. Goal 5. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. 5.1 End all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere. 5.2 Eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. 5.3 Eliminate all harmful practices, such as child, early and forced marriage and female genital mutilation. 5.4 Recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household and the family as nationally appropriate. 5.5 Ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life. 5.6 Ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights as agreed in accordance with the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development and the Beijing Platform for Action and the outcome documents of their review conferences. 5. Undertake reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to ownership and control over land and other forms of property, financial services, inheritance, and natural resources, in accordance with national laws. 5.6 Enhance the use of enabling technology, in particular information and communications technology, to promote the empowerment of women. 5.C Adopt and strengthen sound policies and enforceable legislation for the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls at all levels. Goal 6. Ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. 6.1 By 2030, achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. 6.2 By 2030, achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all and end open defecation, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. 6.3 By 2030, improve water quality by reducing pollution, eliminating dumping and minimizing release of hazardous chemicals and materials, having the proportion of untreated wastewater and substantially increasing recycling and safe reuse globally. 6.4 By 2030, substantially increase water use efficiency across all sectors and ensure sustainable withdrawals and supply of fresh water to address water scarcity and substantially reduce the number of people suffering from water scarcity. 6.5 By 2030, implement integrated water resources management at all levels, including through transboundary cooperation as appropriate. 6.6 By 2020, protect and restore water-related ecosystems, including mountains, forests, wetlands, rivers, aquifers, and lakes. 6. By 2030, expand international cooperation and capacity building support to developing countries in water and sanitation-related activities and programs, including water harvesting, desalination, water efficiency, wastewater treatment, recycling and reuse technologies. 6.6 Support and strengthen the participation of local communities in improving water and sanitation management. Goal 7. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. 7.1 By 2030, ensure universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. 7.2 By 2030, increase substantially the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. 7.3 By 2030, double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. 7. By 2030, enhance international cooperation to facilitate access to clean energy research and technology, including renewable energy, energy efficiency, and advanced and cleaner fossil fuel technology, and promote investment in energy infrastructure and clean energy technology. 7.6 By 2030, expand infrastructure and upgrade technology for supplying modern and sustainable energy services for all in developing countries, in particular least developed countries, small island developing states and landlocked developing countries, in accordance with their respective programs of support. Goal 8. Promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. 8.1 Sustain per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances and, in particular, at least 7% or gross domestic product growth per annum in the least developed countries. 8.2 Achieve higher levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading and innovation, including through a focus on high value-added and labor-intensive sectors. 8.3 Promote development-oriented policies that support productive activities, decent job creation, entrepreneurship, creativity, and innovation, and encourage the formalization and growth of micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, including through access to financial services. 8.4 Improve progressively, through 2030, global resource efficiency in consumption and production and endeavor to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation, in accordance with the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production, with developed countries taking the lead. 8.5 By 2030, achieve full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men, including for young people and persons with disabilities, and equal pay for work of equal value. 8.6 By 2020, substantially reduce the proportion of youth not in employment, education or training. 8.7 Take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers, and by 2025 end child labor in all its forms. 8.8 Protect labor rights and promote safe and secure working environments for all workers, including migrant workers, in particular women migrants, and those in precarious employment. 8.9 By 2030, devise and implement policies to promote sustainable tourism that creates jobs and promotes local culture and products. 8.10 Strengthen the capacity of domestic financial institutions to encourage and expand access to banking, insurance and financial services for all. 8. Increase aid for trade support for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, including through the Enhanced Integrated Framework for Trade-Related Technical Assistance to Least Developed Countries. 8. By 2020, develop and operationalize a global strategy for youth employment and implement the Global Jobs Pact of the International Labour Organization. Goal 9. Build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. 9.1 Develop quality, reliable, sustainable and resilient infrastructure, including regional and transborder infrastructure, to support economic development and human well-being, with a focus on affordable and equitable access for all. 9.2 Promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization and, by 2030, significantly raise industry's share of employment and gross domestic product, in line with national circumstances, and double its share in least developed countries. 9.3 Increase the access of small-scale industrial and other enterprises, in particular in developing countries, to financial services, including affordable credit, and their integration into value chains and markets. 9.4 By 2030, upgrade infrastructure and retrofit industries to make them sustainable, with increased resource use efficiency and greater adoption of clean and environmentally sound technologies and industrial processes, with all countries taking action in accordance with their respective capabilities. 9.5 Enhance scientific research, upgrade the technological capabilities of industrial sectors in all countries, in particular developing countries, including, by 2030, encouraging innovation and substantially increasing the number of research and development workers per 1 million people in public and private research and development spending. 9. To facilitate sustainable and resilient infrastructure development in developing countries. Through enhanced financial, technological, and technical support to African countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries and small island developing states. 9.6 Support domestic technology development, research, and innovation in developing countries, including by ensuring a conducive policy environment for, inter alia, industrial diversification and value addition to commodities. 9.c Significantly increase access to information and communications technology and strive to provide universal and affordable access to the Internet in least developed countries by 2020. Goal 10. Reduce inequality within and among countries. 10.1 By 2030, progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. 10.2 By 2030, empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status. 10.3 Ensure equal opportunity and reduce inequalities of outcome, including by eliminating discriminatory laws, policies, and practices and promoting appropriate legislation, policies and action in this regard. 10.4 Adopt policies, especially fiscal, wage and social protection policies, and progressively achieve greater equality. 10.5 Improve the regulation and monitoring of global financial markets and institutions and strengthen the implementation of such regulations. 10.6 Ensure enhanced representation and voice for developing countries in decision-making in global international economic and financial institutions in order to deliver more effective, credible, accountable, and legitimate institutions. 10.7 Facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. 10. Implement the principle of special and differential treatment for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, in accordance with World Trade Organization agreements. 10.b Encourage official development assistance and financial flows, including foreign direct investment, to states where the need is greatest, in particular least developed countries, African countries, small island developing states and landlocked developing countries, in accordance with their national plans and programs. 10.c By 2030, reduce to less than 3% of the transaction costs of migrant remittances and eliminate remittance corridors with costs higher than 5%. Goal 11. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 11.1 By 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. 11.2 By 2030, provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems for all, improving road safety, notably by expanding public transport, with special attention to the needs of those in vulnerable situations, women, children, persons with disabilities and older persons. 11.3 By 2030, enhance inclusive and sustainable urbanization and capacity for participatory, integrated and sustainable human settlement planning and management in all countries. 11.4 Strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. 11.5 By 2030, significantly reduce the number of deaths and the number of people affected, and substantially decrease the direct economic losses relative to global gross domestic product caused by disasters, including water-related disasters, with a focus on protecting the poor and people in vulnerable situations. 11.6 By 2030, reduce the adverse per capita environmental impact of cities, including by paying special attention to air quality and municipal and other waste management. 11.7 By 2030, provide universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible, green and public spaces, in particular for women and children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. 11. To support positive economic, social, and environmental links between urban, peri-urban, and rural areas by strengthening national and regional development planning. 11.6 By 2020, substantially increase the number of cities and human settlements adopting and implementing integrated policies and plans towards inclusion, resource efficiency, mitigation and adaptation to climate change, resilience to disasters, and develop and implement, in line with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, holistic disaster risk management at all levels. 11.c Support least developed countries, including through financial and technical assistance, in building sustainable and resilient buildings utilizing local materials. Goal 12. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. 12.1 Implement the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns, all countries taking action, with developed countries taking the lead, taking into account the development and capabilities of developing countries. 12.2 By 2030, achieve the sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. 12.3 By 2030, have per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reduce food losses along production and supply chains, including post-harvest losses. 12.4 By 2020, achieve the environmentally sound management of chemicals in all wastes throughout their life cycle, in accordance with agreed international frameworks, and significantly reduce their release to air, water and soil in order to minimize their adverse impacts on human health and the environment. 12.5 By 2030, substantially reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reuse. 12.6 Encourage companies, especially large and transnational companies, to adopt sustainable practices and to integrate sustainability information into their reporting cycle. 12.7 Promote public procurement practices that are sustainable, in accordance with national policies and priorities. 12.8 By 2030, ensure that people everywhere have the relevant information and awareness for sustainable development and lifestyles in harmony with nature. 12. To support developing countries to strengthen their scientific and technological capacity to move towards more sustainable patterns of consumption and production. 12.6 Develop and implement tools to monitor sustainable development impacts for sustainable tourism that creates jobs and promotes local culture and products. 12.c Rationalize inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption by removing market distortions, in accordance with national circumstances, including by restructuring taxation and phasing out those harmful subsidies, where they exist, to reflect their environmental impacts, taking fully into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimizing the possible adverse impacts on their development in a manner that protects the poor and the affected communities. Goal 13. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. 13.1 Strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. 13.2 Integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. 13.3 Improve education, awareness raising and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning. 13. Implement the commitment undertaken by developed country parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to a goal of mobilizing jointly $100 billion annually by 2020 from all sources to address the needs of developing countries in the context of meaningful mitigation actions and transparency on implementation, and fully operationalize the Green Climate Fund through its capitalization as soon as possible. Acknowledging that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the primary international, intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. 13.6 Promote mechanisms for raising capacity for effective climate change-related planning and management in least developed countries and small island developing states, including focusing on women, youth, and local and marginalized communities. Goal 14. Conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. 14.1 By 2025, prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds, in particular from land-based activities, including marine debris and nutrient pollution. 14.2 By 2020, sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts, including by strengthening their resilience, and take action for their restoration in order to achieve healthy and productive oceans. 14.3 Minimize and address the impacts of ocean acidification, including through enhanced scientific cooperation at all levels. 14.4 By 2020, effectively regulate harvesting and end overfishing, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing and destructive fishing practices, and implement science-based management plans, in order to restore fish stocks in the shortest time feasible, at least to levels that can produce maximum sustainable yield as determined by their biological characteristics. 14.5 By 2020, conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas, consistent with national and international law and based on the best available scientific information. 14.6 By 2020, prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies, recognizing that appropriate and effective special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries should be an integral part of the World Trade Organization fisheries subsidies negotiation. 14.7 By 2030, increase the economic benefits to small island developing states and least developed countries from the sustainable use of marine resources, including through sustainable management of fisheries, aquaculture, and tourism. 14. Increase scientific knowledge, develop research capacity and transfer marine technology, taking into account the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission criteria and guidelines on the transfer of marine technology, in order to improve ocean health and to enhance the contribution of marine biodiversity to the development of developing countries, in particular small island developing states and least developed countries. 14. B. Provide access for small-scale artisanal fishers to marine resources and markets. 14. C. Enhance the conservation and sustainable use of oceans and their resources by implementing international law as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of taking into account ongoing World Trade Organization negotiations, the Doha Development Agenda, and the Hong Kong Ministerial Mandate. The C, which provides the legal framework for the conservation and sustainable use of oceans and their resources, as recalled in paragraph 158 of The Future We Want. Goal 15. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. Sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. 15.1 By 2020, ensure the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of terrestrial and inland freshwater ecosystems and their services, in particular forests, wetlands, mountains, and drylands, in line with obligations under international agreements. 15.2 By 2020, promote the implementation of sustainable management of all types of forests, halt deforestation, restore degraded forests and substantially increase afforestation and reforestation globally. 15.3 By 2030, combat desertification, restore degraded land and soil, including land affected by desertification, drought, and floods, and strive to achieve a land degradation neutral world. 15.4 By 2030, ensure the conservation of mountain ecosystems, including their biodiversity, in order to enhance their capacity to provide benefits that are essential for sustainable development. 15.5 Take urgent and significant action to reduce the degradation of natural habitats, halt the loss of biodiversity and, by 2020, protect and prevent the extinction of threatened species. 15.6 Promote fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources and promote appropriate access to such resources, as internationally agreed. 15.7 Take urgent action to end poaching and trafficking of protected species of flora and fauna, and address both demand and supply of illegal wildlife products. 15.8 By 2020, introduce measures to prevent the introduction and significantly reduce the impact of invasive alien species on land and water ecosystems and control or eradicate the priority species. 15.9 By 2020, integrate ecosystem and biodiversity values into national and local planning, development processes, poverty reduction strategies and accounts. 15. Immobilize and significantly increase financial resources from all sources to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity and ecosystems. 15. B. Mobilize significant resources from all sources and at all levels to finance sustainable forest management and provide adequate incentives to developing countries to advance such management, including for conservation and reforestation. 15. C. Enhance global support for efforts to combat poaching and trafficking of protected species, including by increasing the capacity of local communities to pursue sustainable livelihood opportunities. Goal 16. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. 16.1 Significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. 16.2 End abuse, exploitation, trafficking and all forms of violence against and torture of children. 16.3 Promote the rule of law at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. 16.4 By 2030, significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets and combat all forms of organized crime. 16.5 Substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. 16.6 Develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. 16.7 Ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. 16.8 Broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance. 16.9 By 2030, provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. 16.10 Ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms, in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. 16. Strengthen relevant national institutions, including through international cooperation, for building capacity at all levels, in particular in developing countries, to prevent violence and combat terrorism and crime. 16.6 Promote and enforce non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. Goal 17. Strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. Finance. 17.1 Strengthen domestic resource mobilization, including through international support to developing countries, to improve domestic capacity for tax and other revenue collection. 17.2 Developed countries to implement fully their official development assistance commitments, including the commitment by many developed countries to achieve the target of 0.7% of gross national income for official development assistance, ODA/GNI, to developing countries and 0.15 to 0.20% of ODA/GNI to least developed countries, ODA. Providers are encouraged to consider setting a target to provide at least 0.20% of ODA/GNI to least developed countries. 17.3 Mobilize additional financial resources for developing countries from multiple sources. 17.4 Assist developing countries in attaining long-term debt sustainability through coordinated policies aimed at fostering debt financing, debt relief, and debt restructuring, as appropriate, and address the external debt of highly indebted poor countries to reduce debt distress. 17.5 Adopt and implement investment promotion regimes for least developed countries. Technology. 17.6 Enhance North-South, South-South, and triangular regional and international cooperation on and access to science, technology, and innovation and enhance knowledge sharing on mutually agreed terms, including through improved coordination among existing mechanisms, in particular at the United Nations level, and through a global technology facilitation mechanism. 17.7 Promote the development, transfer, dissemination and diffusion of environmentally sound technologies to developing countries on favorable terms, including on concessional and preferential terms, as mutually agreed. 17.8 Fully operationalize the Technology Bank and Science, Technology, and Innovation capacity building mechanism for least developed countries by 2017 and enhance the use of enabling technology, in particular information and communications technology. Capacity building. 17.9 Enhance international support for implementing effective and targeted capacity building in developing countries to support national plans to implement all the sustainable development goals, including through North-South, South-South, and triangular cooperation. Trade. 17.10 Promote a universal, rules-based, open, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system under the World Trade Organization, including through the conclusion of negotiations under its Doha Development Agenda. 17.11 Significantly increase the exports of developing countries, in particular with a view to doubling the least developed countries' share of global exports by 2020. 17.12 Realize timely implementation of duty-free and quota-free market access on a lasting basis for all least developed countries, consistent with World Trade Organization decisions, including by ensuring that preferential rules of origin applicable to imports from least developed countries are transparent and simple, and contribute to facilitating market access. Systemic issues. Policy and institutional coherence. 17.13 Enhance global macroeconomic stability, including through policy coordination and policy coherence. 17.14 Enhance policy coherence for sustainable development. 17.15 Respect each country's policy space and leadership to establish and implement policies for poverty eradication and sustainable development. Multi-stakeholder partnerships. 17.16 Enhance the global partnership for sustainable development, complemented by multi-stakeholder partnerships that mobilize and share knowledge, expertise, technology and financial resources, to support the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals in all countries, in particular developing countries. 17.17 Encourage and promote effective public-private and civil society partnerships, building on the experience and resourcing strategies of partnerships. Data, monitoring, and accountability. 17.18 By 2020, enhance capacity building support to developing countries, including for least developed countries and small island developing states, to increase significantly the availability of high-quality, timely, and reliable data disaggregated by income, gender, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, geographic location, and other characteristics relevant in national contexts. 17.19 By 2030, build on existing initiatives to develop measurements of progress on sustainable development that complement gross domestic product and support statistical capacity building in developing countries. Means of implementation and the global partnership. 60 We affirm our strong commitment to the full implementation of this new agenda. We recognize that we will not be able to achieve our ambitious goals and targets without a revitalized and enhanced global partnership and comparably ambitious means of implementation. The revitalized global partnership will facilitate an intensive global engagement in support of implementation of all the goals and targets, bringing together governments, civil society, the private sector, the United Nations system and other actors and mobilizing all available resources. 61 The agenda's goals and targets deal with the means required to realize our collective ambitions. The means of implementation targets under each Sustainable Development Goal and Goal 17, which are referred to above, are key to realizing our agenda and are of equal importance with the other goals and targets. We shall accord them equal priority in our implementation efforts and in the global indicator framework for monitoring our progress. 62 This agenda, including the Sustainable Development Goals, can be met within the framework of a revitalized global partnership for sustainable development, supported by the concrete policies and actions outlined in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is an integral part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda supports, complements, and helps to contextualize the 2030 Agenda's means of implementation targets. It relates to domestic public resources, domestic and international, private business and finance, international development cooperation, international trade is an engine for development, debt, and debt sustainability, addressing systemic issues and science, technology, innovation, and capacity building, and data, monitoring and follow-up. 63 Cohesive nationally owned sustainable development strategies, supported by integrated national financing frameworks, will be at the heart of our efforts. We reiterate that Each country has primary responsibility for its own economic and social development, and that the role of national policies and development strategies cannot be overemphasized. We will respect each country's policy space and leadership to implement policies for poverty eradication and sustainable development, while remaining consistent with relevant international rules and commitments. At the same time, national development efforts need to be supported by an enabling international economic environment, including coherent and mutually supporting world trade, monetary and financial systems, and strengthened and enhanced global economic governance processes to develop and facilitate the availability of appropriate knowledge and technologies globally, as well as capacity building, are also critical. We commit to pursuing policy coherence in an enabling environment for sustainable development at all levels and by all actors, and to reinvigorating the global partnership for sustainable development. 64. We support the implementation of relevant strategies and programs of action, including the Istanbul Declaration and Program of Action, the SIDS Accelerated Modalities of Action, Samoa, Pathway, and the Vienna Program of Action for Landlocked Developing Countries for the decade 2014 to 2024, and reaffirm the importance of supporting the African Union's Agenda 2063 and the program of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, all of which are integral to the new agenda. We recognize the major challenge to the achievement of durable peace and sustainable development in countries in conflict and post-conflict situations. 65. We recognize that middle-income countries still face significant challenges to achieve sustainable development. In order to ensure that achievements made to date are sustained, efforts to address ongoing challenges should be strengthened through the exchange of experiences, improved coordination, and better and focused support of the United Nations Development System, the international financial institutions, regional organizations, and other stakeholders. 66. We underscore that, for all countries, public policies, and the mobilization and effective use of domestic resources, underscored by the principle of national ownership, are central to our common pursuit of sustainable development, including achieving the sustainable. 3. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda of the Third International Conference on Financing for Development. Addis Ababa Action Agenda, adopted by the General Assembly on July 27, 2015, Resolution 69/313. Development Goals. We recognize that domestic resources are first and foremost generated by economic growth, supported by an enabling environment at all levels. 67. Private business activity, investment, and innovation are major drivers of productivity, inclusive economic growth and job creation. We acknowledge the diversity of the private sector, ranging from micro-enterprises to cooperatives to multinationals. We call upon all businesses to apply their creativity and innovation to solving sustainable development challenges. We will foster a dynamic and well-functioning business sector, while protecting labor rights and environmental and health standards in accordance with relevant international standards and agreements, and other ongoing initiatives in this regard, such as the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the Labor Standards of the International Labor Organization, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and key multilateral environmental agreements, for parties to those agreements. 68. International trade is an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction, and contributes to the promotion of sustainable development. We will continue to promote a universal, rules-based, open, transparent, predictable, inclusive, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system under the World Trade Organization, as well as meaningful trade liberalization. We call upon all members of the World Trade Organization to redouble their efforts to promptly conclude the negotiations on the Doha Development Agenda. We attach great importance to providing trade-related capacity building for developing countries, including African countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small island developing states, and middle-income countries, including for the promotion of regional economic integration and interconnectivity. 69. We recognize the need to assist developing countries in attaining long-term debt sustainability through coordinated policies aimed at fostering debt financing, debt relief, debt restructuring, and sound debt management, as appropriate. Many countries remain vulnerable to debt crises, and some are in the midst of crises, including a number of least developed countries, small island developing states, and some developed countries. We reiterate that debtors and creditors must work together to prevent and resolve unsustainable debt situations. Maintaining sustainable debt levels is the responsibility of the borrowing countries. However, we acknowledge that lenders also have a responsibility to lend in a way that does not undermine a country's debt sustainability. We will support the maintenance of debt sustainability of those countries that have received debt relief and achieved sustainable debt levels. 70. We hereby launch a technology facilitation mechanism which was established by the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in order to support the Sustainable Development Goals. The technology facilitation mechanism will be based on a multi-stakeholder collaboration between member states, civil society, the private sector, the scientific community, United Nations entities and other stakeholders, and will be composed of a United Nations Inter-Agency Task Team on Science, Technology, and Innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals, a collaborative multi-stakeholder forum on science, technology, and innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals, and an online platform. Sent the United Nations Interagency Task Team on Science, Technology, and Innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals will promote coordination, coherence, and cooperation within the United Nations system on science, technology, and innovation. Related matters, enhancing synergy and efficiency, in particular to enhance capacity building initiatives. The task team will draw on existing resources and will work with 10 representatives from civil society, the private sector, and the scientific community to prepare the meetings of the multi-stakeholder forum on science, technology, and innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as in the development and operationalization of the online platform, including preparing proposals for the modalities for the forum and the online platform. The 10 representatives will be appointed by the Secretary General for periods of 2 years. The task team will be open to the participation of all United Nations agencies, funds, and programs and the functional commissions of the Economic and Social Council, and it will initially be composed of the entities that currently integrate the informal working group on technology facilitation, namely, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the Secretariat, the United Nations Environment Program, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the International Telecommunication Union, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and the World Bank. Sent the online platform will be used to establish a comprehensive mapping of, and serve as a gateway for, information on existing science, technology, and innovation initiatives, mechanisms, and programs, within and beyond the United Nations. The online platform will facilitate access to information, knowledge, and experience, as well as best practices and lessons learned, on science, technology, and innovation facilitation initiatives and policies. The online platform will also facilitate the dissemination of relevant open access scientific publications generated worldwide. The online platform will be developed on the basis of an independent technical assessment which will take into account best practices and lessons learned from other initiatives, within and beyond the United Nations, in order to ensure that it will complement, facilitate access to and provide adequate information on existing science, technology, and innovation platforms, avoiding duplications, and enhancing synergies. Sent the Multi-Stakeholder Forum on Science, Technology, and Innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals will be convened once a year, for a period of 2 days, to discuss science, technology, and innovation cooperation around thematic areas for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, congregating all relevant stakeholders to actively contribute in their area of expertise. The forum will provide a venue for facilitating interaction, matchmaking, and the establishment of networks between relevant stakeholders and multi-stakeholder partnerships in order to identify and examine technology needs and gaps, including on scientific cooperation, innovation, and capacity building, and also in order to help to facilitate development, transfer, and Dissemination of relevant technologies for the Sustainable Development Goals. The meetings of the forum will be convened by the President of the Economic and Social Council before the meeting of the high-level political forum under the auspices of the Council or, alternatively, in conjunction with other forums or conferences, as appropriate, taking into account the theme to be considered and on the basis of a collaboration with the organizers of the other forums or conferences. The meetings of the forum will be co-chaired by 2 member states and will result in a summary of discussions elaborated by the 2 co-chairs, as an input to the meetings of the high-level political forum, in the context of the follow-up and review of the implementation of the post-2015 development agenda. The meetings of the high-level political forum will be informed by the summary of the multi-stakeholder forum. The themes for the subsequent multi-stakeholder forum on science, technology, and innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals will be considered by the high-level political forum on sustainable development, taking into account expert inputs from the task team. 71. We reiterate that this agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals and targets, including the means of implementation, are universal, indivisible and interlinked. Follow-up and review. 72. We commit to engaging in systematic follow-up and review of the implementation of this agenda over the next 15 years. A robust, voluntary, effective, participatory, transparent, and integrated follow-up and review framework will make a vital contribution to implementation and will help countries to maximize and track progress in implementing this agenda in order to ensure that no one is left behind. 73. Operating at the national, regional, and global levels, it will promote accountability to our citizens, support effective international cooperation in achieving this agenda and foster exchanges of best practices and mutual learning. It will mobilize support to overcome shared challenges and identify new and emerging issues. As this is a universal agenda, mutual trust and understanding among all nations will be important. 74. Follow-up and review processes at all levels will be guided by the following principles. A. They will be voluntary and country-led, will take into account different national realities, capacities, and levels of development and will respect policy space and priorities. As national ownership is key to achieving sustainable development, the outcome from national level processes will be the foundation for reviews at the regional and global levels, given that the global review will be primarily based on national official data sources. B. They will track progress in implementing the universal goals and targets, including the means of implementation, in all countries in a manner which respects their universal, integrated and interrelated nature and the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. C. They will maintain a longer-term orientation, identify achievements, challenges, gaps and critical success factors and support countries in making informed policy choices. They will help to mobilize the necessary means of implementation and partnerships, support the identification of solutions and best practices and promote the coordination and effectiveness of the international development system. D. They will be open, inclusive, participatory, and transparent for all people and will support reporting by all relevant stakeholders. E. They will be people-centered, gender-sensitive, respect human rights and have a particular focus on the poorest, most vulnerable, and those furthest behind. F. They will build on existing platforms and processes, where these exist, avoid duplication and respond to national circumstances, capacities, needs and priorities. They will evolve over time, taking into account emerging issues and the development of new methodologies, and will minimize the reporting burden on national administrations. G. They will be rigorous and based on evidence, informed by country-led evaluations and data which is high quality, accessible, timely, reliable, and disaggregated by income, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migration status, disability, and geographic location and other characteristics relevant in national contexts. H. They will require enhanced capacity building support for developing countries, including the strengthening of national data systems and evaluation programs, particularly in African countries, least developed countries, small island developing states, landlocked developing countries and middle-income countries. I. They will benefit from the active support of the United Nations system and other multilateral institutions. 75 The goals and targets will be followed up and reviewed using a set of global indicators. These will be complemented by indicators at the regional and national levels which will be developed by member states, in addition to the outcomes of work undertaken for the development of the baselines for those targets where national and global baseline data does not yet exist. The global indicator framework, to be developed by the Interagency and Expert Group on Sustainable Development Goal Indicators, will be agreed by the Statistical Commission by March 2016 and adopted thereafter by the Economic and Social Council and the General Assembly, in line with existing mandates. This framework will be simple yet robust, address all sustainable development goals and targets, including for means of implementation, and preserve the political balance, integration, and ambition contained therein. 76 We will support developing countries, particularly African countries, least developed countries, small island developing states and landlocked developing countries, in strengthening the capacity of national statistical offices and data systems to ensure access to high-quality, timely, reliable, and disaggregated data. We will promote transparent and accountable scaling up of appropriate public-private cooperation to exploit the contribution to be made by a wide range of data, including Earth observation and geospatial information, while ensuring national ownership in supporting and tracking progress. 77 We commit to fully engage in conducting regular and inclusive reviews of progress at the subnational, national, regional, and global levels. We will draw as far as possible on the existing network of follow-up and review institutions and mechanisms. National reports will allow assessments of progress and identify challenges at the regional and global level. Along with regional dialogues and global reviews, they will inform recommendations for follow-up at various levels. National level. 78 We encourage all member states to develop as soon as practicable ambitious national responses to the overall implementation of this agenda. These can support the transition to the Sustainable Development Goals and build on existing planning instruments, such as National Development and Sustainable Development Strategies, as appropriate. 79 We also encourage member states to conduct regular and inclusive reviews of progress at the national and subnational levels which are country-led and country-driven. Such reviews should draw on contributions from indigenous peoples, civil society, the private sector and other stakeholders, in line with national circumstances, policies, and priorities. National parliaments as well as other institutions can also support these processes. Regional level. 80 Follow-up and review at the regional and sub-regional levels can, as appropriate, provide useful opportunities for peer learning, including through voluntary reviews, sharing of best practices and discussion on shared targets. We welcome in this respect the cooperation of regional and sub-regional commissions and organizations. Inclusive regional processes will draw on national level reviews and contribute to follow-up and review at the global level, including at the high-level political forum on sustainable development. 81 Recognizing the importance of building on existing follow-up and review mechanisms at the regional level and allowing adequate policy space, we encourage all member states to identify the most suitable regional forum in which to engage. United Nations regional commissions are encouraged to continue supporting member states in this regard. Global level. 82 The high-level political forum will have a central role in overseeing a network of follow-up and review processes at the global level, working coherently with the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council and other relevant organs and forums, in accordance with existing mandates. It will facilitate sharing of experiences, including successes, challenges and lessons learned, and provide political leadership, guidance, and recommendations for follow-up. It will promote system-wide coherence and coordination of sustainable development policies. It should ensure that the agenda remains relevant and ambitious and should focus on the assessment of progress, achievements, and challenges faced by developed and developing countries as well as new and emerging issues. Effective linkages will be made with the follow-up and review arrangements of all relevant United Nations conferences and processes, including on least developed countries, small island developing states and landlocked developing countries. 83 Follow-up and review at the high-level political forum will be informed by an annual progress report on the Sustainable Development Goals to be prepared by the Secretary General in cooperation with the United Nations system, based on the Global Indicator framework and data produced by national statistical systems and information collected at the regional level. The high-level political forum will also be informed by the Global Sustainable Development Report, which shall strengthen the science policy interface and could provide a strong evidence-based instrument to support policymakers in promoting poverty eradication and sustainable development. We invite the President of the Economic and Social Council to conduct a process of consultations on the scope, methodology, and frequency of the global report as well as its relation to the progress report, the outcome of which should be reflected in the ministerial declaration of the session of the High-Level Political Forum in 2016. 84 The High-Level Political Forum, under the auspices of the Economic and Social Council, shall carry out regular reviews, in line with General Assembly Resolution 67/290 of July 9, 2013. Reviews will be voluntary, while encouraging reporting, and include developed and developing countries as well as relevant United Nations entities and other stakeholders, including civil society and the private sector. They shall be state-led, involving ministerial and other relevant high-level participants. They shall provide a platform for partnerships, including through the participation of major groups and other relevant stakeholders. 85 Thematic reviews of progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, including cross-cutting issues, will also take place at the high-level political forum. These will be supported by reviews by the functional commissions of the Economic and Social Council and other intergovernmental bodies and forums which should reflect the integrated nature of the goals, as well as the interlinkages between them. They will engage all relevant stakeholders and, where possible, feed into, and be aligned with, the cycle of the high-level political forum. 86 We welcome, as outlined in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the dedicated follow-up and review for the financing for development outcomes as well as all the means of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals which is integrated with the follow-up and review framework of this agenda. The intergovernmentally agreed conclusions and recommendations of the annual Economic and Social Council Forum on Financing for Development will be fed into the overall follow-up and review of the implementation of this agenda in the high-level political forum. 87 Meeting every 4 years under the auspices of the General Assembly, the high-level political forum will provide high-level political guidance on the agenda and underscore its implementation, identify progress and emerging challenges and mobilize further actions to accelerate implementation. The next high-level political forum under the auspices of the General Assembly will be held in 2019, with the cycle of meetings thus reset, in order to maximize coherence with the quadrennial comprehensive policy review process. 88 We also stress the importance of system-wide strategic planning, implementation and reporting in order to ensure coherent and integrated support to the implementation of the new agenda by the United Nations Development System. The relevant governing bodies should take action to review such support to implementation and to report on progress and obstacles. We welcome the ongoing dialogue in the Economic and Social Council on the longer-term positioning of the United Nations Development System and look forward to taking action on these issues, as appropriate. 89 The high-level political forum will support participation in follow-up and review processes by the major groups and other relevant stakeholders in line with Resolution 67/290. We call upon those actors to report on their contribution to the implementation of the agenda. 90 We request the Secretary General, in consultation with member states, to prepare a report for consideration at the 70th session of the General Assembly in preparation for the 2016 meeting of the High-Level Political Forum, which outlines critical milestones towards coherent, efficient, and inclusive follow-up and review at the global level. The report should include a proposal on the organizational arrangements for state-led reviews at the high-level political forum under the auspices of the Economic and Social Council, including recommendations on voluntary common reporting guidelines. It should clarify institutional responsibilities and provide guidance on annual themes, on a sequence of thematic reviews. and on options for periodic reviews for the high-level political forum. 91. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to achieving this agenda and utilizing it to the full to transform our world for the better by 2030. United Nations. Sustainable Development.un.org